The sudden silence was as deafening as the sound had been. Chapter 9. That morning, while the pre-dawn shadows were still cold and blue, Gibbons and White Fox had watched as Jett rode out of sight. Then they returned to the makeshift laboratory she'd created in the Allsup saloon. Hours passed as he watched her pace back and forth, muttering to herself. From time to time she would stop and leaf through some notes she had surely memorized by now, or go to stare at the makeshift map on the wall. As inscrutable as her work might be, Gibbons's frequent detours to the street to gaze at the position of the sun, and then at the watch pinned to the front of her jacket, were utterly transparent. Jett was late. Jett Gallatin is a very resourceful individual. I am certain this delay in her return has a wholly innocent cause. White Fox offered at last, voicing a certainty he was far from feeling. Many of the Anglos who came west seemed to feel neither law nor custom bound them any longer. The army functioned as much as policemen as a military instrument, and in his time with the army White Fox had seen things he once would not have scrupled to name madness. He knew, perhaps better than Gibbons or even Jett, what men and women were capable of when they felt they were beyond the reach of punishment. Gibbons grumbled something under her breath and resumed her pacing. From time to time she'd settle into her chair to consult her notes and the tiny spell book belonging to Trooper Lincoln. But such stillness would only last for a few minutes before she was on her feet once more. Finally, as the afternoon light slanted across the floor, White Fox could bear Gibbons's pacing and semi-audible mutters no longer. My friend Dr. Singer was a wise and educated man, he said. Gibbons gave no indication that she had heard him, but White Fox was reasonably convinced she was able to think and listen at the same time. The two things are not necessarily the same, he added dryly, slanting a sideways glance at Gibbons. She continued to ignore him. One day, when I was still among the Meshwaka hockey, there came a day I happened to be with him when he was urgently summoned, so he was told to a deathbed. White Fox continued. He asked me to accompany him, and I did. The lady had been traveling when she was taken ill, and when we arrived at the stagecoach stop, he found several other females present at her bedside. They had removed her outer garments, but despite the fact she was unconscious and obviously in deep distress, none of them was doing anything. "It's that patent corset she is wearing," one lady cried out to Dr. Singer as he moved to examine her. "We can't get it off her." "Exactly why I refuse to wear the miserable things," Gibbons interjected crossly. White Fox reflected that she was surprisingly charming when she was annoyed. Her cheeks flushed to becoming pink and her eyes sparkled. She might have said more, but White Fox prevented her by resuming his tale. Dr. Singer snatched his scalpel from his black bag. "Clearly you ladies never heard of Alexander the Great," he growled, and in an instant he sliced through the knotted laces. The lady's breathing eased at once. White Fox smiled faintly. Dr. Singer was persuaded of her full recovery when she snatched up her parasol and... He broke off at the sudden sound of hoofbeats. Nightingale. From the sound, Jett was returning with urgent news. Perhaps his anecdote would not be needed after all. He hurried to the street to greet her, but the moment he saw the empty saddle, his heart sank. Nightingale had returned alone. The stallion shied violently when he reached White Fox and danced to a halt a few yards away. He was covered in foam, and his mouth was bleeding where the bit had cut him. White Fox had seen Jett ride often enough to know she could never have done this damage. Someone else had obviously grabbed the stallion by the rein. "Something has gone wrong," White Fox said as Gibbons joined him. "Yes," Gibbons snapped. "That much is clear even to me." "I wish you could talk," she said to Nightingale. The stallion skittered even further out of reach, ears flat back, then extended his neck hopefully. "I'm not chasing you all over the landscape," Gibbons said crossly. Nightingale minced toward her and finally nudged her shoulder. Gibbons reached up to stroke his muzzle. "Where is she?" Gibbons asked the stallion. "Captured," White Fox said needlessly. "Perhaps she is already dead," he added in reluctant tones. He hated to think it, but he remembered Jett's tale of her escape from Allsup. He'd later seen with his own eyes what Nightingale had braved to rescue her, and so he knew Nightingale wouldn't have abandoned Jett. Not if she'd been anywhere in sight when he was attacked. "No," Gibbons exclaimed. Nightingale flung his head up at her vehemence. "Not you," she said, patting his neck. White Fox saw her set her jaw in determination. "We'll see about that," she said grimly. Under Shepard's supervision, Jett retraced her steps back to the main room, down its length, and through the second doorway. She'd expected a second corridor, but it opened at once into another room, at least the size of the one she'd just left. There wasn't enough light to see clearly, but between the light from the other room and the lamp Shepard carried, Jett could see the shadowy outline of a long marble-topped table. The shroud-covered body on it gave the table the look of a mortuary slab. Shepard ushered her further into the room. When she was standing where he wanted her, he set the lamp down on the end of the table and walked away to light more lamps. This was a chance at escape. She turned and ran for the doorway. But before she could reach it, the sound of a shot echoed loudly through the room. The bullet struck the wall ahead of her and sprayed her face with dust. Jett recoiled and staggered sideways, falling against the wall beside the doorway. "The next one goes into you, Miss Gallatin," Shepard called cheerfully. "Do not try me." She turned around slowly. He brandished the Colt. "Now come here," Shepard said. He motioned her forward with the gun barrel until she was standing within reach, then dragged her into the shadows. Before she could get a good look around, he yanked her hands up over her head and shoved her back against the wall. She tried to lower her arms, but he'd hooked the handcuff chain over something. As she struggled, Shepard stuffed the Colt back into his waistband and reached toward her neck. For an instant, Jett thought he was about to strangle her, but what he did was worse. He closed an iron collar around her throat. When she tried to pull away from the wall again, she couldn't. "I'm sure this is more comfortable for both of us," Shepard said, smirking unpleasantly. "Happy to swap places with you," Jett said tightly. "You damned fool. You should have run when he walked you out of the house. You let him waltz you down here like a calf to the branding, and now he's got you roped and tied." Shepard ignored her remark and walked away. No matter how hard she struggled, Jett couldn't pull free of the collar. She hadn't heard a padlock click, and she didn't hear one rattle as she struggled. It was probably held shut by a simple latch. She'd left the cuffs loose when she put them on, and whatever they were hooked over was something she could pull against. So if I can get my hands free, maybe I can get loose again. At least Shepard was ignoring her right now. As he walked around the room lighting lamps, the shadows receded until Jett could see clearly. There was a barred door, like a jailhouse door, off to her right. It was set flush to the wall, and all she could see behind it was shadows. She didn't want to think about what Shepard might be keeping in that cell. As she worked doggedly at pulling her hands free, she studied the room. It was as large as she'd guessed. Shepard only had 5 bullets left, and she didn't think he was carrying more. If she could make him empty his gun, it would come down to a brawl. She was pretty sure she could win it, if she had her hands free. The opposite wall held shelves filled with jars and boxes. It had a work table in front of it. Why, I bet that table could seat 30 for supper and not leave them to bump elbows, she thought in disbelief. It was covered with a litter of bottles and tubing and jars, and looked like the fancified cousin of the mess Gibbons had made of the Allsup saloon. "But as I was saying, before you so rudely interrupted me," Shepard said, replacing the last chimney on the last lamp, "if you place your hopes in my failure to enlist willing followers in my crusade, you underestimate my genius. I've always known I must be able to count upon my acolytes' unthinking devotion, which means I must indicate that I can both punish and reward, as did the biblical patriarchs of old." He walked back to the mortuary slab and yanked the sheet from the body. It was a child, a boy. He was thin and frail, and dressed for burial in his Sunday suit. "That's Sister Catherine's boy, Davy," Jett said hoarsely. She'd stopped struggling with the cuffs the moment Shepard turned his attention to her again, but she knew now she could get them off if she had a little peace and privacy. If he meant to leave her like this, he was in for a surprise when he came back. "How insightful of you, Miss Gallatin," Shepard said. "You guess my methods already. Dear loyal Sister Catherine. She never realized I had no intention of curing her boy, as if anyone could cure consumption. And yet, I will reward her by raising him up into eternal sinless life. She'll never believe that," Jett said. "He's dead. Anyone can see it." "Oh, I beg to differ. He will smell of the flowers of paradise instead of the stink of the grave. And seeing that, what grief-crazed mother would prefer to believe her beloved son was dead? A pity that he's been chosen for a great heavenly task and so is called away, but a great honor as well. But rest assured, I shall give her his words of love and devotion myself." There isn't any word vile enough for what you are, Jett said. Of course Sister Catherine would believe everything Shepard told her. She'd seen David die. Visionaries are scorned by the common herd, Shepard said airily, tossing the shroud casually over the body again. But just as I reward my faithful, you, I am very much afraid, are going to become an example of my wrath. Shepard walked to his workbench, hunted around for a moment, then picked up a tiny syringe. He removed the stopper from a bottle filled with dark liquid and filled the syringe. Jett began to struggle with the handcuffs again, not caring now if Shepard saw her. I don't know what's in that, but I'm damned if I'm opening my mouth so he can dose me. One of her hands slipped halfway through its cuff, then stuck fast. Just a few more seconds, she prayed silently. That's all I need. A hypodermic syringe can be used to introduce a concentrated dose of my elixir directly into the body, Shepard announced. It's far more efficient that way, as you're about to discover. Jett didn't know what a hypodermic syringe was, but it didn't sound good. As Shepard walked toward her, she saw there was a needle on the syringe's end, and she redoubled her efforts to escape. Suddenly her right hand slipped free. The chain clattered over whatever her cuffs were hung on, then caught fast. She kicked out at him and tried to hit him, hauling against the remaining cuff with all her strength. He evaded her blows easily and grabbed her arm. Jett screamed in panic and outrage as Shepard stuck the needle into her flesh just above her elbow. Her mouth went dry and tasted of metal. A burning pain spread through her arm, and she broke out in a cold sweat. When Shepard released her arm, it flopped to her side. She couldn't raise it, not to smack that smug smirk off his face, not to wipe the sweat from her eyes. The floor seemed to shift and slide beneath her feet. Her knees buckled, and she began to gasp for air. Now the only thing holding her upright was the collar around her throat. Her whole weight was hanging from it, and it was choking her. From somewhere that seemed very far away, she heard Shepard's voice. The beauty of my elixir is that it can be administered either before or after death. But before is so much more entertaining. Nightingale finally permitted White Fox to lead him down to the livery stable. Gibbons returned to the saloon to pace, her mind working furiously. She refused to believe Jett was dead. Certainly Brother Shepard was no stranger to murder. But how would he react to someone simply trying to break into his secret lair? He will decide she is a common thief, Gibbons told herself determinedly. Jett is in trouble, probably captured, but I must believe Brother Shepard means to question her. And that means she is still alive. Would Jett tell him anything? Betray what she knew? Admit she wasn't working alone? Not likely, Gibbons decided. She knew something of Jett's history by now. Jett considered herself the citizen of a conquered nation. If the destruction of her home couldn't break her, one lunatic preacher never would. Or at least, Gibbons amended to herself, not in less than a day. White Fox returned from settling Nightingale in the stables. He looked utterly grim. I should have gone with her, he said. Then I would be faced with the need to rescue both of you, Gibbons answered sharply. At least this way we're free to plan. She frowned. But without the information she went to find, I am not certain just how we're going to rescue her. She knew she didn't need to go into detail. They'd both seen the zombie army Brother Shepard could command. Even if she pushed the auto-tachopode to its top speed, Jerusalem's wall was hours away. And reaching Jerusalem's wall was only the first step. They'd have to find Jett and free her. If they succeeded, Shepard would know his secret was out, and that would be bad enough. It would be worse if they were delayed at Jerusalem's wall until after sundown. White Fox regarded her silently for a moment. As I was saying before Nightingale arrived, Dr. Singer, Gibbons stopped to glare at him. I assume there is some obscure and inscrutable reason to tell me this story now, Mr. Fox, she said wrathfully. But I cannot imagine what it could be. So why don't you just tell me what you want me to know? The gentleman who summoned Dr. Singer to attend his wife assumed she was ill, yet the truth was far simpler. In just that way, you wish to know how these zombies are created, because you believe knowing that will tell you how to lay them to rest. But I think you might well be hunting the wrong hare. You already know how to kill them. Salt. I know it. Put down one of them, Mr. Fox, Gibbons replied, her irritation growing. But Mr. Finley wasn't one of the ordinary run of zombies, if one can even imagine such a thing. I can't assume the same method will do for all of them, because... But you do know that, Gibbons, White Fox persisted. You have not just the answer, but its proof. Remember what Jett told us about the meal she was served. He didn't say anything more. Her eyes narrowed, and she dredged the fragment of information out of her memory. Suddenly her eyes widened in realization. There was no salt in it, not in any of it. White Fox nodded. That must be deliberate. If Brother Shepherd has, as you think, engineered a scientific method of creating walking dead, the absence of salt, tells us he knows salt will put them down. She almost shouted. By heaven, I would bet that there is not one grain of salt anywhere on that property. Tarnation. I have been hunting the wrong hare. I need to determine a way to get salt into a great number of the creatures at once, and as quickly as possible. She went to her makeshift desk and began feverishly sketching and scribbling. There was no time for fear. She had work to do. Hours later, her sketches had become a weapon. Gibbons could only thank Providence and her own determination to be prepared for anything, for the fact that she carried a length of fire hose in her supplies. Normally, she filled the auto-tacopode's boiler with buckets, but water sources weren't always conveniently situated. She kept the hose stored under the wagon to save space, but now she'd need to have it instantly ready for use. She rummaged out another hose clamp. In her first test, the hose had immediately torn free of the pipe end when it was pressurized. The White Fox had clearly gotten the valve wrenched down as tightly as it would go. The only way we are going to fly to Jett's rescue is if we can get this thing working properly. Otherwise, we will surely fall beside her, which is not, I think, what she would wish. Hand me that screwdriver, please, and come lean on this wrench, Gibbons said. You are much stronger than I am. Gibbons stepped back. White Fox moved quickly to obey. He hadn't made a single protest all this time, though Gibbons knew he doubted Jett was still alive. It might be that this rescue attempt was a forlorn hope, and possibly foolhardy as well. There were only two of them, and if Nightingale had come tearing back here without Jett, then Jett was almost certainly already dead. Or worse, one of the zombies by now. The sensible thing to do would be to point the autolacopode north, and not stop until they reached the walls of Fort San Antonio. They could say Brother Shepherd was building a militia, that he planned to take over this part of Texas, that he had an arsenal and was going to make himself into a little tin-crown king. That would get the army to come on the double, and Gibbons could make sure she was there and handy with answers when they discovered just what sort of force Brother Shepherd had under his command. The best thing, the most intelligent thing, the most logical course of action was to carry a warning to others. Bother logic. Gibbons snarled aloud as she screwed down the final fitting on her device. Help me get this into the back of the auto-tacopode, she commanded. We're going after Jett. The first thing Jett realized was how cold she felt. For a moment she thought Nightingale must have thrown her, because she was lying against something hard and every muscle ached. Then memory returned. Shepherd. The zombies. The inner prayer house. She floundered upright, gritting her teeth at the surge of nausea and pain. But at least her hands were free. She had a muddled memory of Shepherd removing the collar and the remaining handcuff bracelet then, walking her over into the cell. Was he gone? He'd left the lamps lit. She crawled over to the cell door and used the bars to drag herself to her feet. She tried the door, but of course it was locked. Still getting her bearings, she held her breath, listening intently for any sign she wasn't alone. Nothing. Still holding on to the bars for support, she turned around to look at the interior of her prison. David's body was lying on the floor at the back of the cell. The sight of him galvanized her to full alertness. He died 2 days ago, but our blessed founder has promised to raise him up on the third day. Sister Catherine's words echoed through her mind. Today was the third day. David was going to rise as a zombie tonight. It had been around noon when Shepherd brought her down here. What time was it now? How close was it to sunset? What did Shepherd have to do to raise up a zombie besides dose somebody with that swamp water of his? He'd injected her with it. If that poison's going to kill me, I'm going to make sure he goes first, Jett vowed grimly. She had to get out of here. How? The walls and the back were solid rock, and the bars went all the way up into more rock. The keys. Gibbons gave me half the keys in Alsop. Had the jailhouse key been one of them? Had Shepherd taken her reticule? She patted herself down quickly. No, she still had it. She dredged up her skirts and wrenched the neck of the bag open to pull out a fistful of keys. She sorted quickly through them to find the likeliest-looking one. She might be able to pick a lock, but she couldn't pick one blind and working backward. Was this the jailhouse key? It looked like it. She groped around the lock plate to make sure it had a regular keyhole, then clutched the key in her fingers and reached through the bars until she was at the best angle she could manage. She closed her eyes so she could concentrate. Her fingertips ached with the strain, but if she dropped the key, she might be dropping her only means of escape. There, it was in the keyhole. She tried to twist it, but it wouldn't turn. She had to get a better grip, and to do that, she had to let go of it. The moment she did, the key fell from the lock and bounced away. She could see it. It was caught in the raised fringe at the edge of the carpet. Was it out of reach? She got quickly down on her knees, then stretched out full length, straining to reach as far as she could through the bars. Her fingertips just brushed the teeth of the key. She scrabbled frantically and brought it under her fingers. The air turned suddenly cold. Jett recoiled, clutching the key in her hand. Everything down here smelled of putrefaction, to the point she'd almost gotten used to the smell. But suddenly the stench was stronger. She dragged herself to her feet again, glancing anxiously over her shoulder. The corpse in her cell was still immobile. Once more she fitted the key into the lock. It fit, but nothing she could do would make it turn. With a muffled curse, she threw it through the bars. The air was cold enough now to make her shiver. She breathed through her nose, trying to ignore the stink of corruption, because when she breathed through her mouth, she could taste it. Over and over she held her breath to listen. She was almost sure she could hear something. A sound like a wind blowing through dry autumn leaves, or 100 voices all whispering at once. She bit her lips so hard she tasted blood and chose another key. If she wanted to escape, she didn't dare hurry. She fit the second key into the lock, gripped it tightly, and twisted. The key turned. Suddenly she heard a distant thud, loud enough to drown out the whispering Jett wasn't sure she heard. Another. Then footsteps. Shepard had opened the cellar doors. She'd been unconscious too long. He was coming back. An instant more, and she was easing the cell door open. The room spun dizzily as she stepped through it. She was weaker than she'd realized. But if Shepard was back, the cellar doors were unlocked. She looked around frantically for a weapon, any weapon. At last she picked up one of the lamps. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. She moved toward the doorway to hide. But she'd miscalculate the time it would take Shepard to get here. He came through the doorway when she was still in plain sight. She threw the lamp at him and ran toward another one. He batted the first lamp reflexively away. It struck the floor, where the alcohol inside it spilled from the reservoir, and suddenly the carpet was in flames. "Get her," Shepard shouted. He hadn't come alone this time. She grabbed another lamp and whirled around. The man behind her lunged for it, and for Jett, but he missed. The lamp arced through the air, struck the edge of the table, and smashed. A second man seized her around the waist, swinging her around. Jett kicked and fought, forcing him to lift her off the floor, then flung her head back as hard as she could. There was a crunch. Broken nose, she thought with a flash of glee. She managed to land a lucky kick that sent his partner sprawling into the middle of the flames. He howled in fear, beating out the fire with his hands. Shepard threw a pitcher of water over him before stepping up to Jett and punching her in the stomach. Hard. As she choked and gagged, he hit her across the face. It was an open-handed blow, but it was on the same side he'd hit her with the gun butt earlier. For an instant, the world went white. It took both of his bully boys to hold her down on the marble slab as Shepard wrenched her arms behind her back and cuffed her again. This time he closed the cuffs so tight she knew she would soon be unable to feel her hands. The others yanked her upright, one holding onto each arm, and turned her to face Shepard. She fought and struggled, but she couldn't get loose. "It's time for you to join the purified army of the blessed resurrected, Miss Gallatin," Shepard said. "No," she shouted desperately. "Listen to me. Shepard isn't a holy man. There aren't any blessed resurrected. He doesn't bring the dead back to life, he animates corpses. He's a thief and a madman." For a moment she dared to hope her words had some effect. "He pays well," one of the men said. Shepard chuckled. "Brother Nathan was one of my first followers. He is a pure spirit, truly blessed with the wisdom of the Lord. As his brother Saul. I'll see the lot of you burn in hell," Jett cried. The man Shepard had called Brother Saul laughed. "Save us a seat, darlin'." Shepard gagged her with a handkerchief. She tried to spit it out, but he tied it so tightly it dragged her mouth open into a parody of a smile. Now she couldn't speak, but she could still scream. They carried her up the stairs into the bunkhouse. The bunkhouse was bakingly hot, but after the chill of the underground rooms, the heat was a relief. Shepard opened the outer door without stopping to close the cellar doors. As her captors dragged her outside, she saw it was just dusk. Shepard's whole congregation was standing in patient rows outside the door of the ranch house, as if they were soldiers on parade. Bizarrely, the organ she'd seen in the chapel had been brought out and placed to their right. A dozen tall wrought iron candelabrum, their fat tallow candles flaring and guttering in the night air, provided light. Their presence gave the scene a weirdly exotic look. But Jett spared only a passing glance for the grotesque set dressing. The thing that riveted her attention was in the center of the compound. A post had been placed there, sunk deep into the ground. It was taller than she was, the raw wood still oozing where the twigs and bark had been hastily trimmed away. As Brother Nathan and Brother Saul dragged her toward it, Sister Catherine stepped forward carrying a length of rope. Brother Nathan took the rope, and Brother Saul forced Jett back against the post. She smelled the sharp scent of pine gum. Brother Nathan lashed Jett quickly and efficiently to the post, then stepped back. Sister Catherine came forward. Jett tried to speak, to warn her, "It's a lie. Everything Shepard told you is all a lie. Your boy Davy's dead and he isn't coming back," but she couldn't form intelligible words through the gag. She shouted as loud as she could and whipped her head from side to side. "Don't worry, Sister Jaylene," Sister Catherine whispered, leaning close. "Brother Shepard is a kind and merciful shepherd. You'll see that soon." Jett stared at her in horror, her heart sinking at Sister Catherine's words. Sister Catherine leaned closer and kissed her on the cheek, then turned away to resume her place among the congregation. "My dear brothers and sisters in the fellowship of the blessed resurrection," Shepard said. He walked forward to stand between Jett and his congregation. "I have told you many times that to build the Jerusalem of fire is no easy task. Its path is a hard path, a stony path, a path walked in renunciation. The weight of such privation lames the foot and twists the back. Yet the body broken for everlasting glory is raised up in health and strength at the walls of the Jerusalem of fire." As Shepard began to preach, Nathan and Saul moved to stand on either side of the organ. "Have I told you it is a hard road? I tell you yet again, your eyes will be washed in salt tears 1,000 times before you see its end. And at its wayside stand many, the liars, the idlers, the thieves, the drunkards, the unchaste, eager to offer you comfort and ease. Many times have I spurned them, but you must have faith only in God, and from men ask proof. Here is my proof, the woman sent to seduce me from the path of righteousness." Shepard gestured sweepingly toward Jett as a murmur ran through his congregation. He moved closer to them and spoke in confiding tones, but Jett could still hear him perfectly well. "You might say to me, Brother Shepard, you are a humble and a God-fearing man. You might say to me, Brother Shepard, God has given into your hands the power of the patriarchs of old. Surely, surely, it is your right to strike down this red-mouthed harlot who has set herself against the ordained will of God. And I would say to you, it is not I, but God Almighty, the throne of wrath, the builder of the Jerusalem of fire, who will punish or pardon. I have already forgiven this woman, and I will do so again before you all." He turned back to face Jett. "Corrupt vessel of sin and evil, I hold you blameless for your vileness and error. And yet," he turned to face the congregation once more, "and yet surely it is God's right to punish if he will punish, or pardon, if he will pardon. And so I have prayed to him to send his holy angels to mete out his judgment." He strode to the organ and seated himself on its bench. As he did, Brother Nathan stepped behind it and began to pump the bellows. From the first terrible chords Shepard wrung from the instrument, Jett realized what was about to happen. The fellowship began to chant in time to the music, turning it into a grating wail of despair. Jett couldn't get free, but there was nothing to keep the knotted ropes holding her from sliding around the stake. With a great effort, she could turn herself until she was facing the bunkhouse. If she was going to die, she wanted to see it coming. The wind turned suddenly, bitingly cold. A moment later, the first of the zombies staggered from the open door of the bunkhouse. Somehow it was worse not being able to see them clearly, but from the movement of the shadowy shapes in the flickering candlelight, Jett could tell that more and more zombies were coming. The first ones had walked a few steps away from the door and stopped. As more emerged, they jostled the ones in front of them forward a step at a time. There didn't seem to be any rhyme or reason to which ones stayed at the back, which ones moved to the edges of the mob, which ones pressed forward. There'd been, Jett thought, 60 zombies, at most. In Alsop the night the town was killed, and not many more the following night. There were 3 times that number here, and somehow she couldn't keep herself from thinking there must be more down there in the dark. Rotted corpses that had fallen to pieces, fragments too decayed to walk but still, horribly, animated, twitching bits of decaying flesh pulling themselves toward the stairs any way they could. Shepherd played on, but none of his congregation was chanting any longer. And still the zombies stood motionless. There was light enough for Jett to see the zombies clearly. The ones at the front almost looked as if they were still alive. Some of them. What are they waiting for? Jett raged, even though she knew. They were waiting for Shepherd's order. However it would be given. Come if you're coming. The gag reduced her scream to unintelligible grunts. She didn't understand why Shepherd hadn't set them on yet. Suddenly a horrible suspicion struck her. He knows. He's known all along I wasn't alone. Maybe he'd seen Deerfoot's tracks. Maybe he'd sent Nathan or Saul to Alsop to spy. Maybe he'd gone himself. Suddenly Jett realized the rhythm Shepherd set had stumbled, as if someone was banging a drum just out of time. The chanting faltered, and in that moment Jett realized what she was hearing. Not a drum. An engine. Her friends were coming for her. The auto-tachopode was moving with unimaginable speed, as fast as a steam locomotive. She could tell by the steadily louder sound of its engine. At the gallop a good horse could cover a mile every 2 minutes, but it couldn't run flat out for hours. A horse was flesh and blood, not unliving fire and steel. A horse would have more sense than to gallop into the middle of an army of zombies. Jett didn't think Shepherd knew what the sound of the auto-tachopode meant. He might not even be able to hear it over the renewed frenzy of his playing. And Gibbons had no idea what was waiting for her at Jerusalem's wall. Even if she had, she wouldn't believe there was anything her brains and her damn Yankee science couldn't face down. And White Fox, well, he was as loyal a compadre as Jett could ever hope to ride the trail with. He wouldn't let Gibbons come alone, no matter what Gibbons was riding into. There was no way for Jett to warn her friends, or tell them to flee. Even if she hadn't been gagged, Jett knew she couldn't ever be heard over the sound of Shepherd's playing and the noise Gibbons's hellish conveyance made. Suddenly Jett could see light moving over the ground. The auto-tachopode was almost on top of her. She heard scattered screams behind her, almost loud enough to drown out the sound of the engine, and lancing through them, the shriek of the organ. Shepherd struck a final howling discord from his keyboards. The music stopped. The zombies began to shuffle forward. The auto-tachopode jerked to a halt beside Jett. The burning lanterns hanging on each corner of the wagon gave it a spectral appearance, as if it were a death coach. Despite herself, Jett flinched. The death coach only came when someone was going to die. It isn't a death coach. Jett snarled silently. It's Gibbons's dang fool contraption. Before it stopped bouncing against the brake, Gibbons and White Fox jumped down from the bench. Gibbons hadn't vented the boiler, and the clatter of the engine was deafening. But even so, Jett could hear Shepherd start to play again. Don't worry, Gibbons shouted in Jett's direction. But Gibbons looked terrified, and Jett had never seen her show fear. Jett had assumed this was a rescue mission, even if it was a doomed one. But instead of coming toward Jett, Gibbons ran to the back of the wagon. She opened the door and leaped inside. Run, Jett begged silently. You have to run. White Fox got to the back door just in time to receive a narrow coil of canvas. He was wearing heavy leather gauntlets. One end of the coil had a gleaming brass nozzle attached. The other was still inside the wagon. He ran toward the zombies with the nozzle in his hands, unrolling the canvas behind, just as the auto-tachopode let out an ear-splitting shriek. Suddenly the canvas writhed and began to thrash as if it were alive. Now it was a long tube, like a hose, only not made of leather, and its entire length steamed gently. Even from where she was, Jett could feel its heat. The first of the zombies was barely a dozen feet away now. White Fox stood pointing the brass nozzle at the zombies as if the hose were a weapon. Jett could see how hard he had to struggle to hold it steady. But still he waited. Suddenly, though Jett hadn't seen any signal, he released a coupling behind the nozzle. Water so hot it was half steam jetted out to strike the first ranks of the zombie army. In an instant, White Fox was hidden by billowing clouds of steam. Steam that smelled of salt. As the hot salt jet touched each zombie, it broke from its halting shuffle into a lurching run, but not to retreat. They moved forward with grim purpose. The congregation began to scream again, not just a few of them this time, and Jett spared a moment to hope the sounds meant they were too scared to fight back. The organ had fallen silent once more, but suddenly Jett heard a sound that vibrated through the air like the lowest note of an organ 100 times larger. The zombies were wailing. Steam turned the clear, arid desert night into an eldritch landscape obscured by mist, but even now, Jett could see White Fox standing his ground. The first of the zombies reached him. Its clothes were wet and steaming, as if its body was afire. It ignored White Fox as if he didn't exist. Others followed, and all of them ignored him. Jett tensed in fear as they reached her, but they passed her too. Now White Fox raised the nozzle of his hose, so the spray of water showered over the remaining zombies as if it were rain. The creatures continued to ignore him. Every one of them was heading for Brother Shepherd. The hose went limp. The wagon's reservoirs were dry. As the last of the water sputtered from the nozzle in a falling arc, White Fox dropped it to the ground. In the instant it took Jett to realize the temperature was rising, every zombie in the compound fell to the ground, limp, lifeless. At last, there was utter silence for a moment. Then Jett heard a loud mechanical rattle and looked away from the corpses in time to see a trap door open in the side of the auto-tachopode. "I very strongly suggest that no one do anything rash," Gibbons called, leaning out of the back of the wagon. White Fox walked toward Jett, a Bowie knife in his hand. He slipped the blade under the rope and began to cut her free. Suddenly she felt absurdly self-conscious. Her masculine disguise was armor as much as weapon, and at the moment she had neither one. The ropes fell free, and she stepped away from the stake. "I hope you brought my clothes," she snapped at him to disguise her unease. She tried to bring her hands around in front of her, only belatedly remembering the handcuffs still on her wrists. She couldn't feel her hands at all. White Fox smiled at her. "I've brought something more immediately useful," he said, sheathing the knife again. "You're fortunate Gibbons carries handcuff keys at all times." "Likely because anybody who meets her wants to throw her in jail," Jett muttered. White Fox stepped behind her to unlock the cuffs. The moment she could, Jett wrapped her arms around herself, then inspected her hands, flexing the fingers critically. They were discolored and swollen, and there were deep bruises on her wrists. But she was alive, which was more than she'd expected an hour ago. She turned around to look behind her. Her eyes widened. Everyone, Union and Confederate both, had seen Mr. Matthew B. Brady's photographs of battlefields. Jett had never expected to see anything similar in person, but such was the sight before her. The ground was scattered with bodies. There was a mound of them where Shepherd and his organ had been. She had no doubt what was left of Shepherd was at the bottom of that pile. But not all his creations had managed to reach him before he died. Some were sprawled flat as if they'd been running. Others lay in tangled heaps. Some had fallen to their knees and been braced upright by the bodies behind them. Don't mer wesreicht. A zombie's last act is to take vengeance upon its creator. Most of the fellowship of the blessed resurrected had fled in terror. She didn't see either Brother Nathan or Brother Saul, which didn't surprise her. But to Jett's amazement, about 24 of Shepherd's congregation had stood their ground. They huddled together in the open doorway of the ranch house. Some sobbed openly, men and women both. Some prayed loudly. "Now you listen to me." Gibbons strode from the back of her wagon, her coach gun prudently cradled in her arms. "I don't know what this Brother Shepherd told you, and I don't care. He wasn't a saint or a prophet. He was a thief and a murderer. If he told you he could raise the dead, he lied. These bodies are dead flesh, zombies, walking corpses, nothing more." Gibbons walked toward them. Jett followed her. Jett wasn't armed, but she didn't have to be. The fact she was standing here was her weapon. Mr. George Wilson Shepherd had tied her to a stake and called down God's judgment on her. And she was still alive and Shepherd wasn't. She stood beside Gibbons on one side, White Fox on the other. If these bodies had really been alive, do you think a little dose of hypersalinated steam could have killed them? Gibbons demanded. That's all this was, salt water. And it didn't kill them. It just broke your Brother Shepherd's hold over a bunch of carcasses. As Gibbons spoke, a few more members of the fellowship came out of hiding to join their fellows. Suddenly a woman broke away and ran toward the three of them. Jett tensed, and Gibbons swung her gun around. But this wasn't an attack. "Oh, forgive me. Sister Jaylene, forgive me for doubting you," Sister Catherine said. She fell to her knees and clutched at Jett's hands. Despite herself, Jett recoiled. "I take it you know each other?" Gibbons asked. "This is," Jett began. "I told him everything," Sister Catherine said, her words nearly unintelligible through her tears. "Brother Shepherd said if anyone worked against him, God would punish them by denying their family's angelic resurrection." "Zombies," Jett mouthed at Gibbons, who was frowning at her quizzically. "Least said soonest mended, my good woman," Gibbons said crisply. "All water under the bridge. Now if you'll—" "I had to tell him, don't you see?" Sister Catherine went on as if she hadn't heard. "It was for my boy. My boy, my—" Suddenly Sister Catherine faltered to a stop, realizing that if Shepherd was a fraud, her son was truly dead. As she broke into hysterical howls of grief, Jett stared at Gibbons and White Fox in horror. There was still one zombie unaccounted for.